quietest serial killers in history, what the media didn't talk about. The most dangerous killer isn't always the one you heard about. When people think of serial killers, they picture the famous ones. The names repeated in documentaries. The faces printed in newspapers. The courtroom sketches. The endless headlines. The monster becomes public. The story becomes entertainment. The fear becomes visible. But history hides a much darker category. The killers who stayed quiet. The ones who didn't become media legends. The ones who moved through hospitals, neighborhoods, villages, highways, institutions, and ordinary life without becoming a national obsession. Not because they were less dangerous, but because the system around them stayed silent. Sometimes the police didn't connect the cases. Sometimes the victims were poor, isolated, elderly, or ignored. Sometimes the press didn't care. Sometimes the state didn't want panic. And sometimes the truth was simply inconvenient. That is what makes these cases so disturbing, because the most terrifying serial killer is not always the most brutal. Sometimes it is the one who was allowed to keep going because no one wanted to look too closely. This is the quietest serial killers in history, what the media didn't talk about. A documentary about the killers who operated in the shadows of public attention, and the systems that helped keep them there. And in part 1, we begin with the most uncomfortable truth of all. A serial killer doesn't need supernatural intelligence to survive. Sometimes all they need is institutional silence. Wonder why some killers become legends and others become footnotes. The public likes a killer it can package. A shocking nickname. A dramatic arrest. A recognizable face. A city in panic. A press machine that turns horror into narrative. But many serial killers don't fit that formula. They kill in places the media barely visits. They target people the system barely protects. They operate inside professions people are trained to trust. Or they spread their crimes so thin across time and geography that nobody sees the shape until years later. This is the first hidden truth of serial murder. Detection is not only about evidence. It is about attention. A case with rich victims, urban panic, and sensational details becomes national news. A case involving the elderly, the poor, migrants, psychiatric patients, sex workers, or institutionalized people may barely register. And that gap is where some of the deadliest killers in history have lived. Not in genius, not in invisibility, but in indifference. That is what this video is really about. Not just killers, but the conditions that made them quieter than they should have been. Because when the media doesn't amplify a case, the public thinks the threat is smaller. And sometimes the false silence becomes part of the body count. To Harold Shipman, the killer who hid inside trust, if there's one case that perfectly represents the horror of quiet serial murder, it is Harold Shipman. Shipman did not lurk in alleyways. He did not need a mask, a van, or a public mythology. He was a doctor. That fact alone is enough to explain why his crimes feel different from the killers people usually talk about. Because a doctor is not only a person. A doctor is a trusted system in human form. You let a doctor into the most vulnerable moments of your life. You accept pain, treatment, medication, and judgment because the role itself carries authority. And Shipman understood exactly how powerful that shield was. He murdered patients, many of them elderly women, while maintaining the outward appearance of a respected general practitioner. Death around him did not immediately trigger national hysteria because death around the doctor could look natural. That is what made the case so horrifying. His crimes were hidden inside normality, inside routine, inside expected decline, inside the quiet bureaucratic language of medicine. And here the media angle becomes essential. If Shipman had been a stranger stalking victims publicly, the story would have exploded earlier. But because he was a doctor and because many victims were elderly, the pattern remained harder to see and easier for institutions to rationalize. How many deaths are too many before someone asks the question? How many grieving families are dismissed because they trust the paperwork more than their instinct? How many bodies pass through the system before the system admits it may be protecting the wrong person? Shipman's case forces a brutal conclusion. Sometimes the most effective serial killer is not the one who hides from institutions. It is the one who is protected by them. And once you understand that, the conspiracy feeling in this subject becomes sharper. Because the question is no longer just how did he do it? It becomes, how many warnings were easier to ignore than to investigate? Breathe the angel of death phenomenon when killing wears a uniform. Shipman was not the only killer to use trust as camouflage. History contains a deeply disturbing category often described as angel of death kills murderers working inside hospitals, care homes, clinics, or medical systems. This category terrifies people for a reason, because the crime scene is already filled with suffering, already filled with fragile bodies, already filled with plausible death. That means murder can blend into expected decline. A patient worsens. An old person dies. A dose is given. A monitor changes. A chart is updated. And the institution moves on. Now, not every suspicious pattern is murder. Medical environments are complicated, chaotic, and full of natural loss. But that complexity also creates cover. And in case after case, investigators later found something that should have been caught earlier. Clusters. Too many deaths. Too many incidents on one shift. Too many coincidences around one staff member. Too many quiet suspicions dismissed because nobody wanted to accuse a healer of becoming a predator. This is where media silence becomes almost structural. Hospitals don't want panic. Administrators don't want scandal. Authorities don't want to accuse staff without certainty. Families often lack the power or information to push back. So the environment protects itself first. And that protection can last long enough for the killer to continue. That is one of the ugliest patterns in hidden serial murder. The institution does not need to help directly. It only needs to resist embarrassment long enough. Poor nanny dolls of the killer hidden in domestic life. Some killers disappear not because the system protects them, but because society refuses to imagine danger in familiar places. That is why Nanny Doss matters. She became known for poisoning multiple family members, including husbands, in a life that outwardly looked domestic, ordinary, almost boring. And that is exactly the point. Public fear tends to imagine serial killing as something male, public, mobile, and visibly predatory. A stranger, a drifter, a hunter in the dark. But domestic murder can be quieter, slower, and easier to disguise. A husband dies unexpectedly. An illness looks ordinary. A family tragedy is absorbed into private grief. No national manhunt follows. No newspaper frenzy erupts immediately. This is one reason certain female serial killers historically receive different media treatment, sometimes sensationalized after exposure, but often underestimated before it. Their crimes were hidden inside roles society considered harmless. Wife, caretaker, nurse, relative, and because those roles are associated with safety, suspicion arises late. Very late. Doss reminds us that silence is not only institutional, it can be cultural. Society often fails to recognize the murderer who fits too easily into expected social patterns. And once again, that delay creates space. Space to kill. Space to repeat. Space for the story to remain private until it becomes impossible to contain. Far the less important the victim, the quieter the killer. This may be the darkest sentence in the entire subject. Some serial killers last longer because their victims are not treated as socially urgent. That is not theory. That is history. When victims are sex workers, migrants, addicts, homeless people, the elderly, disabled people, psychiatric patients, or poor women in neglected areas, the public and institutional response often changes. Slower investigations. Less media intensity. Less political pressure. Less outrage. And killers notice that. Maybe not consciously in strategic language, but predators learn environments. They learn which disappearances trigger alarm and which ones sink quietly into the background. This is where the media didn't talk about it angle becomes more than a title. Because silence is not random. Media's silence often mirrors social hierarchy. A missing rich student can become national news. Multiple dead women from the margins may receive a fraction of that attention. And when that happens, a killer is not merely hiding. He is operating inside a ranking system of human value. That is what makes these cases feel almost conspiratorial, not necessarily because someone planned the silence, but because the silence behaves like a system. Everyone does just little enough. Everyone cares just little enough, and the result looks from the outside like protection. 6. The killers no one connected. Not all quiet serial killers worked in institutions. Some survived because police systems were fragmented, data was incomplete, and jurisdiction lines acted like blindfolds. A murder here, a disappearance there, an overdose somewhere else, a dead traveller in another county, a body that isn't identified, a case file that sits in the wrong drawer. Before modern databases and coordinated investigative systems improved, many killers benefited from geography alone. They did not need to be criminal masterminds. They only needed to cross lines, county lines, state lines, class lines, media lines. If one town sees one victim, it sees tragedy. If 5 towns see 5 separate victims, they may never see a serial killer at all. This is one reason some of history's quieter killers feel so ghost-like in retrospect. Not because they were invisible, but because the information that revealed them was scattered across institutions that didn't fully talk to each other. And when the media also failed to connect those cases, the public saw isolated incidents instead of a pattern. Again, attention is everything. A killer is often discovered not when the evidence becomes magical, but when someone finally sees the shape. 7. The conspiracy feeling when people suspect more than one person knew. This is where the tone gets darker, because in many quiet serial murder cases, the public eventually reaches an uncomfortable suspicion. Do the other people know? Maybe not the full truth. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not enough to prove murder in court, but enough to feel something was wrong. A colleague notices a pattern. A supervisor hears concerns. A family member sees too many funerals. A police officer feels a case is off. A journalist hears a rumor that never gets assigned, and yet nothing happens. This is the emotional core of almost every "they didn't talk about" a true crime story. The fear that silence is rarely empty, that around many killers there is an outer ring of discomfort. People who sensed the danger but stayed quiet because accusation is risky, institutions resist scandal, uncertainty is always demanded before courage. Now, to be clear, suspicion is not proof, and not every missed warning means deliberate concealment. But to the public, repeated ignored warnings start to feel like conspiracy even when the real engine is cowardice, bureaucracy, and self-protection. That distinction matters, because evil does not always require active collaboration. Sometimes it only requires enough people choosing not to be the first one to say it out loud. 8. Why the media sometimes arrives too late. People often assume the media exists to expose hidden danger. Sometimes it does, but media is also reactive. It follows spectacle, access, police briefings, audience appetite, and editorial judgment. A killer who produces a clean, dramatic story gets coverage. A killer whose story is slow, ugly, socially inconvenient, or institutionally sensitive may not. That is why some of the quieter serial killer cases only become huge after arrest. Before exposure, the media lacks the hook. After exposure, the media suddenly discovers the narrative and rewrites the whole case as obvious. But it wasn't obvious. That is the lie hindsight tells. Before exposure, the victims were often just local tragedies. After exposure, they become part of a monstrous story everyone claims they were always watching. This is one of the most manipulative things public storytelling does. It compresses years of neglect into one moment of revelation, and in that compression, the silence that allowed the killings gets forgotten. Which is why this video exists. Not just to talk about killers, but to talk about the gap before the headline, because that gap is where people died. Part 1 closing, silence can be a weapon. In Part 1, we looked at the killers who survived not because they were mythical, but because they operated inside trust, indifference, routine, and institutional hesitation. We saw how Harold Schumann turned medicine into camouflage, how angel of death killers use medical environments as cover, how domestic killers like Nanny Doss hid behind ordinary life, how victim status changes media attention, how fragmented systems fail to connect patterns, and how silence, social, bureaucratic, and professional can become part of a kill chain. But Part 2 goes even deeper, because next, we'll look at the cases where the silence feels almost intentional, where rumors of state failure, police minimization, media disinterest, and bird patterns make the story feel less like ordinary neglect, and more like something people were never supposed to see clearly. Because the quietest serial killers are not only the ones who hid well, sometimes they are the ones hidden by the world around them. Part 2. The scariest serial killer isn't always the one who hid best. By now, you've seen the pattern. Some killers don't survive because they are smarter than everyone else. They survive because they are protected by silence. Silence in hospitals. Silence in police departments. Silence in communities. Silence in the media. Silence around victims the world has already decided not to prioritize. That is what makes the quietest serial killers so different from the famous ones. The famous killers become stories. The quiet ones become paperwork. A strange death. A missing person. An overdose. A patient who didn't make it. A woman no one follows up on. A case that stays local. A pattern nobody wants to say out loud. And that is where the fear gets deeper. Because once murder begins to blend into routine, it stops looking like horror. It starts looking like life. And if it looks enough like life, institutions can walk past it for years. In part 2, we close this story by looking at the real engine behind many silent killing sprees. Not genius, not invisibility, but a world trained to ignore the wrong deaths. Once some killers operate inside a pre-built blind spot, there are places in society where violence is easier to hide, not because people are stupid, but because the environment is already overloaded, underfunded, fragmented, or emotionally numb. A care home where death is common, a hospital ward where crisis is normal, a neighborhood where disappearances are not treated urgently, a rural area where cases don't get national coverage, a highway system that scatters victims across jurisdictions, a social class the cameras rarely visit. This is the first truth of quiet serial murder. Some killers do not create their own camouflage. Society creates it for them. That is why these cases feel so much darker than the headline version of serial crime. The killer is not operating in empty space. He is operating inside a blind spot that existed before he arrived. And once you understand that, you stop asking only, how did the killer hide? You start asking, why was this such a good place to disappear people in the first place? That question is much bigger than any one murderer, because it turns the story back on the world around them. Two in the system doesn't fail, it functions exactly as it usually does. People are more comfortable believing a serial killer succeeded because of a rare mistake. A missed clue, a lazy detective, one bad hospital administrator, one newsroom that didn't care. But some of the most unsettling cases suggest something else. The system didn't break. It behaved normally. That is what makes them terrifying. Because normal procedure may already include not treating certain victims as urgent, not comparing cases across institutions fast enough, not questioning professional authority soon enough, not escalating suspicion without overwhelming proof, not giving local deaths national attention. In other words, some killers are not surviving in spite of the system. They are surviving inside its ordinary habits. That's the point where true crime starts to feel like a conspiracy documentary. Not because there is always a secret plot, but because the outcome can look engineered even when the real cause is structural indifference. And for families of victims, that distinction means almost nothing. Deliberate concealment and habitual neglect leave the same graves behind. Freedom media doesn't just miss stories, it assigns value. We like to think the media reflects reality, but often it ranks it. A victim who is young, photogenic, middle class, and socially recognizable can dominate headlines. A victim who is poor, elderly, addicted, undocumented, institutionalized, or socially isolated may barely make it past a local mention. That gap is not a side issue. It is one of the reasons some serial killers remain quiet for so long, because media attention does more than inform the public. It creates pressure. Pressure on police. Pressure on politicians. Pressure on institutions. Pressure on communities to stop pretending the deaths are unrelated. Without that pressure, cases stay small. And when cases stay small, killers keep moving. This is why the phrase "what the media didn't talk about" matters. Not because every newsroom is hiding the truth in some brand-coordinated way, but because silence itself becomes a kind of editorial decision. And once the public learns that some deaths generate less urgency than others, a darker suspicion begins to grow. How many killers lasted longer simply because their victims weren't considered headline material? That suspicion is not irrational. History gives it teeth. For the most disturbing possibility, other people often felt IT first. One pattern repeats across quiet serial killer cases more often than people like to admit. Before the arrest, before the headlines, before the documentaries, someone often felt that something was wrong. A nurse noticed too many deaths. A relative asked too many questions. A local officer felt a case didn't fit. A co-worker saw a pattern. A journalist heard a rumour no one wanted to put on paper. But feeling is not proof, and institutions reward proof, so the warning stays trapped in the most useless stage of truth. Too serious to ignore emotionally, too incomplete to act unofficially. That's where many killers live the longest, in the gap between suspicion and action. And this is why so many of these cases later produce the same haunted question. Who knew something, or at least sensed something, and said nothing because saying it would have been too dangerous, too embarrassing, too career damaging, or too hard to prove? That question is what makes quiet serial murder feel larger than crime. It begins to feel like social permission. Not explicit permission, not written, but real. Permission created by hesitation. 5. The conspiracy feeling comes from repeated inaction. This is where the tone gets darker. When people say there had to be more to it, they are not always claiming a secret killer network with some dramatic hidden mastermind. Sometimes what they mean is simpler and more disturbing. Too many people failed in the same direction. Too many warnings went nowhere. Too many deaths were minimized. Too many victims fit categories society already devalued. Too many institutions protected themselves before protecting the vulnerable. At that point, the public starts using the language of conspiracy because ordinary language feels too weak. Neglect sounds too passive. Oversight failure sounds too polite. Miscommunication sounds too clean. But repeated inaction around multiple deaths begins to feel like a hidden system even when it is not formally coordinated. And maybe that is the darkest truth in this entire video. A society does not need to consciously help a serial killer. It only needs to keep failing in predictable ways. That is enough. 6. The quietest killers reveal something worse than evil. The famous serial killer story is psychologically comforting in one twisted way. It gives evil a face, a monster, a deviant, a specific person the public can point to and say, "There, that's the problem." But the quietest serial killers reveal something less comfortable. That evil can survive by boring normality, professional trust, social indifference, routine death, class hierarchy, media habits, institutional caution, which means the real horror is not only the killer, it is the environment. The killer is the hand, the environment is the glove, and once you realize that, the story no longer ends with arrest, because removing the killer does not remove the blind spot. If the blind spot remains, history can repeat, maybe with a different name, a different hospital, a different town, a different type of victim, but the same silence, closing that some murderers are hidden by more than darkness. People often say the worst killers hide in the shadows, but that isn't always true. Some hide in daylight, in clinics, in homes, in communities, in systems that know how to process death better than they know how to question it. And the reason they remain quiet for so long is not only that they hide well, it's that the world around them has already decided which lives deserve urgency, and which ones can disappear more softly. That is the final truth behind the quietest serial killers in history. They were not always the smartest, not always the most organized, not always the most careful. Sometimes they were simply standing in the right silence. And that should disturb you more than any famous killer ever could. Because monsters are easier to fight than indifference. And indifference has helped bury more bodies than most people will ever admit. Thanks for watching the quietest serial killers in history, what the media didn't talk about. If this documentary made you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. And tell me in the comments, which case do you think was ignored for far too long?